Have you ever wondered how we're being nickel and dimed to death from seemingly every direction? That it's not even clear in this Byzantine mess we call society exactly how this is happening. If that's the case, where did our resources, our energy, our life, our vitality go? I'm about to demonstrate a working hypothesis, and this is the written article I'm using for reference, that most of us are being poached and have outsourced our most important assets to major institutions, with little left for our own immediate communities. This is the Poacher Hypothesis. So, as a refresher to kind of get our minds set in the right direction, the definition of a poacher is someone who illegally hunts animals and extracts their resources, leaving the natural ecosystem depleted and damaged. So this is kind of metaphorical. I really just needed some new wording, maybe like a catchy phrase to make sense of this and give it a label. And this is what made the most sense to me. So I'm going to paint a picture as an introduction here. We're going to do a little bit of comparison. Our most recent ancestors had real families and real communities. They developed skills, worked the land, and produced their own resources. They inherited traditions in how they produced bread and fermented foods that has a host of benefits, just to name a few examples. There was a division of labor, and in some ways this was gendered between men and women. Dr. Warren Farrell has said that to the degree there is a man's domain of work managed by men, there is also a woman's domain of work managed by women. What is seen as historically women's work is important. It's integral to the health and thriving of the whole tribe. Healthy home-cooked food for your children, shared with friends and family to bond and deepen relationships, the household maintained, to updates one's knowledge of available resources to improve one's recipes, build recipe books, just for example, of healthy, delicious, creative meals. Other skills and the time to even do these things to a high quality might include sewing and mending one's clothing, keeping a clean home that is well designed to meet everyone's needs. This also, kind of in the bigger picture, would include educating and playing with your children, where you can be innovative. You can custom tailor education to your family and community's context. Where this is where you can test philosophy, develop spiritual ideas, and creatively teach each other, learning together. I'm not using this description to say like every tribe, culture, or civilization was this perfect utopia, but just that this is a distinct communal structure and it creates these opportunities and that people discover these things over time. Now let's contrast this. I'm going to build a couple other key pieces here, and I'm referencing the second wave feminist movement because this was an easy way to jump off from. Obviously, we're talking about gender roles and the different ways that people view gender roles historically and recent modern changes in the last 75 to 100 years. So the second wave feminist movement in particular diminished this women's domain of work and created a narrative around it that was inherently oppressive. They claimed no woman would be fulfilled in this kind of role. It was merely a prison of existential dread. Their relationship to men became contentious and overtly sexist over time. This is at odds with building a loving, respectful relationship with a partner and a healthy home to raise children. It suggests a deeper spiritual crisis. They didn't even seem to consider the possibility that a traditional model could have benefits or that the conditions of the mid-20th century were unique, not universal. In fact, what if we look at a model that predates the 1950s, the intergenerational multi-family tribe? This could uplift everyone out of poverty from one generation to the next and develop a spiritually rich, thriving culture. Feminists created an oversimplified, reductive stereotype that today is now called traditional. In my own thinking, I believe it's more accurate to call it mid-century modern. So much of human history predates this one little snapshot that people reference and oversimplify in this like cartoonish manner. And now the end result is this new kind of 21st century narrative. Over about the last 45 years, women have gotten an education, including a college degree, and now work full-time in white-collar jobs for their own money. That's kind of the image people have in their minds. And thus, they are empowered. But there's two big problems here. One, many women who pursue these lifestyles are overworked, exhausted, and miserable. I get the impression that it's just extremely unbalanced, and we're being poached for our energy, our resources, our time, our sanity. And you have to question the paycheck we receive. Is it really enough for how much is being extracted from us? I question if there's this like larger shift in all these different ways, economically, socially, spiritually, psychologically, and it just seems like there was unintended impacts and outcomes that people didn't necessarily predict in recent history in the 20th century. And so take the woman that you have, the image of the woman you have in your mind that people say is the boss babe, and work, I'm going to build my career and work full-time, maybe overtime, and I'm going to really push myself and be very academic, and I'm going to get this standard education, and it just seems exhausting. And personally, with my interests and values, I find that you don't really get a lot of bang for your buck where it really matters. Like, what about if I want to spend time with my children, with my partner, with my friends and family? What if I want to cook and I've learned so much about nutrition and apply that to real life and share a meal with my friends and family. It's just a few examples here that I'm finding people don't know if they have the time, and they're stretched too thin. The other big problem I see with this is that, women that have children, that choose to have children, but also have pursued this like more modern lifestyle, they still have to do something to participate in raising their kids. And everyone, I don't even care that much about gender, whether you want it to be gendered or not, or a little bit gendered. Everybody needs to clean and cook for their family and work together as a group at least sometimes if you want to have a functional family, a functional community. So it's not like we're just going to wave a wand and, all the stuff we've labeled women's traditional work, we're just going to get rid of it, and now we live this leisure-based lifestyle in this utopia. This is important work. This is like part of the basics of being a responsible human being. And so if you're overworked and your life is unbalanced and both parents are exhausted, who's doing this work that's now being neglected? And then perhaps worst of all, kids are often neglected by overworked, exhausted parents who are raised to believe this was the way people should live. The kids are left to be raised by schools that kill the creative learning spirit and remove them from real-world practical education. So just as one example, many new parents, parents of young children, perhaps you have an infant, many young new parents across America who both work full-time are now discovering that daycare would cost the entirety of one parent's income, at least half. I'm not sure why I'd want to work a job I can't stand that depletes me just to pay my entire paycheck for my baby to be raised by strangers. Young children under age 6 absolutely depend on forming trusting attachment bonds. Children cannot bond with strangers more than their family, only to lose those caregivers when they age out of a program. This constant uprooting is actively sabotaging the foundation of stable communities and is traumatic for most of us. This is something where I noticed that, so I grew up in more of a working to middle class area that was kind of a hodgepodge, a mix of a lot of different kinds of people, and that was my normal. And I was transferred out to a school when I was 13 for the second half of my schooling that was in kind of a little bubble. It was like a wealthy town, and it was pretty liberal. And when a lot of my friends got out into the real world, it was insane. They started like having breakdowns. They couldn't cope with the world around them. And a lot of us were not told about, like, here's the things you can do once you become an adult that are meaningful, that people enjoyed, and here's a meaningful life of, like, hey, one day maybe you're going to want a partner, maybe you'll want to get married and have kids, because we don't live forever, and we'd like to have a community, a legacy, that kind of something that continues on into the future, and that gives life meaning because it doesn't last forever. Nobody makes it out of this thing alive, right? And we weren't really told these things. I feel like the adults were really checked out, and a lot of them were very resentful that they had kids at all, and were just angry. So, and then you fast forward, and some of my friends actually had parents that were kinder to them, a little more sane, in this more liberal upper class town, and I had a pretty rough childhood, and I ended up living in a youth housing program as a teenager that saved my life, and it was a miracle. And so I was more in this working class environment, and I had discovered these things that were beautiful and meaningful and life-giving, and that gave me a direction, a hero's journey. And my friends, when they graduated high school or towards the end, or when they started college, they just had this downward spiral, and the instability of being ripped apart to shreds. It's like, what happened to building a stable community? What happened to having lifelong friends and family? And you would kind of pass on the baton generation to generation. It's most of my friends, they would go to college in this part of the country or that part of the country, and they would never see each other again. And it's really destructive. And I think it harkens back to this question of things that have been made normal that shouldn't be normal. And that's partially a reference to The Myth of Normal by Dr. Gabor. So we'll continue here. So women's work is still done by majority women. The only difference now, or the primary difference I see, is that our grandparents and parents' generation sold us off to corporations, government, and large nonprofits. Essentially, these institutions are poachers that were invited into our communities willingly. They harvested our assets, our resources, skills, time, and energy, all for their benefit, be it schools, government programs, nonprofit work, caregiving, or corporate busy work. So many of these fields are female-dominated. Obviously, this is a bit of a simplification, but the world is so crazy right now. We have to simplify in a way that's sanity restoring, and we can navigate, make sense of things, and just make something that works, not something that tells the whole truth of everything. So I'll just add a little bit to this to say that some of what's happened is, in the time period where you could start a small organization as just a humble citizen with not much in your back pocket, or people grew these entities, and eventually they became these really large corporations. And we don't really start small organizations in living, thriving families and communities where everybody is close to each other and knows each other. We don't really have that anymore. I look around, and most people are sucked away from whatever family and friends they might have left to work, and they have very little power and agency over this, obviously in a massive conglomerate, and it's so Byzantine, it's so bureaucratic. Now it starts to feel like these institutions that are increasingly destructive, they're ignorant, they're corrupt, they don't really make sense. They don't necessarily align with our personal values, and we're all kind of under the thumb of these things. And it's there's something wrong here of why do they get so much of my time and energy and resources, and I get so little? I barely get a paycheck now, and there's so much more that's being depleted from me. Someone else I follow is Nate Hagens of The Great Simplification, and he combines an ecological view with an economic view that's just incredible. It's phenomenal, and he explains that sometimes you have a little internal view, and there's externalities, there's things outside of it that are actually affecting it that you're not even paying attention to. While a lot of the fields that I've referenced are considered white collar, there's also some ways in which this is being outsourced to working class jobs, shit jobs, as David Graeber Graeber calls them. And a major example of this would be the fast food industry. We're more dependent on massive corporations that produce junk food that lobby for their benefit at our expense and contain a host of toxic additives. Again, if you're going to a fast food restaurant, how much power do you have over what you're consuming? As far as I see it, the primary benefit of the fast food industry to society is it's one of the few industries left that hires young people for their first jobs. Anyone younger than 40 will tell you how god-awfully hard it is or was to get their first job without any experience or even, a second or third job. And it's getting harder and harder to gain access to an opportunity you can build upon. So I used to work in youth crisis intervention and youth mentorship because I was so inspired after I lived in this housing program that saved my life and gave me a chance. And so, I'm a high school dropout. I've always been adjacent to some of the more mainstream standard institutions in society, and I didn't realize the degree to which my life unfolded where I'm kind of parallel. I didn't really work in the school system. I was a youth advocate and worked in nonprofits and found these alternative avenues. And it's one of the most disempowering parts of society that people can't find an avenue to get an opportunity without already showing they're somehow this expert with the right credentials, with this long track record. It's what happened to you go out and you do something and you get better at it and people are like, you're doing something good and I like what you're doing, and you don't have to have all these credentials in the way that society accepts to become a meaningful contributor. What about an innovative person? What about an independent creator? What about start your own business? People don't understand the legitimacy and value of these things. So there may be benefits to being able to get your first job in fast food, and it's hard, it's not pretty, it's not utopian, but there was a time when my health sucked for a number of reasons, and I was very weak, and my health wasn't cared for when I was a kid, and I grew up, and I got out in the world, and it was brutal, and I worked my ass off, and one of my early jobs, I biked 5 miles there, I worked all day on my feet, and I biked 5 miles home, and my health was not good, so I ended up getting 2 sprained ankles, and I still went to work, and I learned that my feet would go numb, and they wouldn't hurt anymore. These are not pretty things. It's not ideal conditions, but you need something that's an opportunity, and we're losing these things. So as far as fast food is concerned, even if there's still some benefits, these sacrifices are huge. And so some of these sacrifices would include, we're outsourcing our cooking, we're failing to pass down cooking skills and real nutrition education, and then in return becoming dependent on toxic slop. So who says we can't do this work, relating to cooking and nutrition, cooking with each other for ourselves, for our families, maybe starting a small local business where you serve food that's healthy. Who says we can't do this work within our own communities and use that to advocate for, our youth to get opportunities through a communal network? This is called social capital. It is the total access to opportunities and resources through relationships. And if social capital is a form of wealth, modern society has fallen into abject poverty. I am all for a thriving local economy brought back to the hands of local people. Who says we can't start with our own homes, our own kitchens, and a few willing friends and neighbors to create what we truly wish to see in the world? So, obviously, I've made a very strong distinction between massive, large institutions, and we're all outsourced, and small local communities in our own families. This is like a distinction between the two. There's kind of a spectrum where it gets blurry, where you can kind of trend from one to the other, and life is, complex, and we need these simplifications to make sense of what the hell's happening and what to do about it. And so I would say that part of what needs to happen is we need personal relationships with a handful of people in our daily lives where we see each other in real life. We share our lives together. Maybe we live together, we live next door, or we have a dinner a couple of times a week. We want our lives to overlap in person, and that's like the foundation of a community. How do we have any semblance of community or localism if everybody's ripped apart, sent in different directions? We're constantly destabilized and constantly atomized. So what I'm saying is, human beings used to share the labor within their families and immediate tribe. They used to work daily among people they loved and respected, who loved and respected them in return. They used to be business owners working in an ecosystem of small local businesses, organizations, maybe your church or spiritual center, and some nonprofits and clubs, everything. Everything used to be so much more integrated. Most people had relationships with each other, and most people were personally familiar with the small organizations in their community, the trade and the economic activity of their own town. So just remember, I will not profess this was a utopia, even if I'm giving some highlights that sound like they're all very positive. I'm saying that there's a structure here, and there's incredible benefits to it that we're missing right now. And most importantly, real problems, natural disasters, trauma, interpersonal conflict, even serious things would be much easier to survive and heal from in a real human tribe. In our tribe, we have social capital. We have each other's backs, and we can solve problems in a coherent way for our unique circumstances. Now that we've been poached, the end result is that women work among strangers under the pressure and threat of being fired or otherwise punished if they do not adhere to the establishment ideology. Obviously, this is not entirely gendered. Female dominated could be, there's 30% men. Men are affected. I'm sure there's plenty of men out there that work in a female-dominated environment where maybe you're the only guy or one of three there, and it's not a pleasant situation. There's many variations here. There's ways this applies in a gender-mixed setting, too. And so just to talk about the kind of white-collar institutional culture that's formed, I've worked in these environments. I worked in youth service nonprofits. I worked related to homeless issues. I worked for an adult housing program, and the larger cultural trend across, you could say, white-collar America became more liberal. And this came with required beliefs you weren't really allowed to diverge from. And I think this is a bit insidious, it's subtle. And so that you look at America's recent history in the 20th century, and you look at the civil rights movement, really great things happened. And this had an influence on our legal and ethical rules and institutions, things we developed to try to find a way to coexist, support each other's rights and empowerment. This is really difficult stuff, with America being such a convoluted mess of different subcultures and types of people with different needs. And it's really hard to do. As this structure formed, it created this culture that had a liberal bias, and these things start out subtle, and it kind of goes down a certain path over time. And anybody who holds differing beliefs, it was very clear that increasingly so, these things, not liberal, were not work appropriate. What started out, functional enough has devolved radically. The standard rules and policies have become more censorious and frankly ignorant, squeezing everyone a little harder. Eventually, this gave way to a leftist ideology that has become so authoritarian, frankly outright bigoted, cartoonishly bigoted, and utterly incoherent, with internal contradictions, that the majority cannot survive this way. My latest favorite phrase of the week has been, I want to develop a worldview that is sanity restoring, not crazy making. So we have to question, was this really for the better, or are we now overworked for the benefit of these large institutions with no energy, resources, or time left to invest in our own families and communities? So this is what I call the Poacher Hypothesis. So it may feel overwhelming to try finding solutions when the problem feels so all-encompassing, but perhaps we can start with small things and come together with whoever we can find who's willing to hear us out. I strongly believe, this is really important, that we have hidden social capital, opportunities, potential friends, and resources hiding in plain sight all around us. But that many people have been so beat up, broken, and demoralized that they've never had the time to think, what's out there that I'm not seeing? What if there's an unexpected opportunity I can't even imagine unless I leave my house and look for it? So I will leave you with a call to action. I do not have all the answers for every person's unique circumstances and needs, but perhaps there are universal things that almost all of us could apply. I'll put my money where my mouth is, and I'll do it myself. Here are 3 things I challenge each of us to do. 1, cook a meal together with friends and family. Whoever you invite that actually shows up. Put all distractions away. No smartphones, no junk. Set up the table. Even whatever you have available. We've sat on the floor together. Share a meal without distractions and practice holding conversation. Additionally, a point of recommendation, you can write down a few friendly questions or even jokes to spark conversation if needed. We're in very, very contentious times, and people are struggling to figure out how to speak to each other, and you don't always know what other people's beliefs are compared to yours, and so you might pick who you invite, try to make the best of it, and not cram people together that are so radically different from each other. It'd be utter chaos. That might be a big challenge. And then try to find icebreakers that would bridge gaps and bring people together in things that everyone understands and relates to. And that's a good starting place. And so number 2, solve a problem and help a friend. Find someone you know who has a problem and offer your help to solve it. Pick something small enough, or at least find a small piece of a big problem to start with. And if you really don't know what to do and you have no idea where to start, or your friend has no idea where to start, just go for a walk outside. Find somewhere that's, really lovely in nature if you can. Whatever you can find, and just be a listening ear. Maybe they'll start telling you things and surprise you, and you'll get ideas, and you'll just have a good time. It's a good starting place. And just at the very least, you give your friend a distraction from things that are not going well in life, right? And so number 3 is do something hands-on in quiet. Hands-on activities are healing to the brain. They help us process emotions, unlock creativity, and give us energy. It may not feel good at first. In fact, you might feel like shit, depending on how life's going for you right now. Perhaps your mind is totally shut down at blank, or perhaps bombarding you with thoughts, And we need to do this hands-on work. It's really healing for us. And you let your brain do what it's going to do, take it along for the ride, and you do the work anyway. It's like a buoy in the waves of the ocean. Always come back to the work and see for yourself what the results are. And you'd be really surprised by this if you haven't actually done this and realized how much it changes your mind, body, and spirit. So I hope this serves you well. I'm always excited for creative thinkers, innovators, and active participants. So if you have taken these action steps, or if you've gained something from this, or if you have your own ideas, please share in whatever capacity you can. There's multiple ways to contact me. That's on, be it my YouTube page or on Discord, and so on and so forth. So thank you, and best of luck on your journey.